Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am so happy to be able to share these thoughts and experiences with you today. First, I would like to say how happy I am to be back in Japan because I came to Japan many years ago as a 20-year-old journalist and fell in love with the country. And then, so I lived here for 2 years, and then I came back a few years later to conduct a 14-month field research for my doctoral dissertation. And then a few years later, after I got my PhD and started teaching as a professor at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, I had an opportunity to teach for 1 semester at the branch campus of SIU in Nakajo. So today, I'm continuing sort of a journey of working on peace studies, and it was actually during my trip to Nakajo, or my teaching at the SIU branch campus in Nakajo, that I had the opportunity to write my first book on peace, which was published by Kinseido in Japan and was used widely in Japanese universities to teach English as a second language. So this was actually an ESL textbook, just 18 short units. And then later, as a professor at St. Cloud State University, I taught a course that was titled Peace for Our Planet, which is also the title of my talk today. And in 2017, I published a new book, which you see here, which distilled the results of my 20 years of studying peace-related areas. I used the same title, but this is a very different book than the first one I had written. So let me start by stating the main objectives for our discussion today. As you know, the world is currently going through a new stage of upheaval and turmoil. And the horrific events that we see on our screens, on TV, and so on, can be so devastating that at times they can cause us to lose hope in our ability to do anything about them, right? Sometimes you feel that. But we can't allow that to happen, because hope is a vital prerequisite for us to be able to take empowered action toward building a more peaceful world. It's really a prerequisite for doing anything, because without hope, we just become paralyzed and we're not able to take any action. So my first goal for today is to present some key insights into the historical progress toward peace in a way that can give us real hope, real evidence-based reasons for hope in our ability to make a difference in the world and to make it a better place. And in addition to having real hope, in order to be able to create a more peaceful world, we need to develop the appropriate leadership culture. In other words, we need a paradigm shift for the leadership culture that can actually lead us to peace, not war. So let's begin our discussion by taking a macro historical perspective on humanity's progress toward peace during the last 200 years. In the dominant way of thinking, people tend to view historical progress toward a more civilized world in general as a linear process, right? For example, people think, okay, we took 2 steps forward and then bad things are happening, we're taking, one step back, or somehow we're going in a zigzag, or at best we're going up and down, like in a spiral fashion, where we may just be moving forward incrementally. But so from this linear point of view, before I make the next point, whenever there are any setbacks, it may appear that human society is going backward, and there is nothing we can do about it. But I have found in my research that in the last 2 centuries, human civilization has not been moving forward in a straight line, but rather into separate and parallel processes, one constructive, the other destructive. And importantly, the constructive process has not stopped. It has never stopped, nor can it be turned back. So while there is no doubt that the processes of destruction and disintegration going on in the world today are quite real, it is also true that another profoundly real process is unfolding alongside the destructive process, and that is the process of constructive integration. And although this constructive process is less visible to our casual everyday glance, it is a reality that is moving forward in the world parallel to the destructive process, and it can be seen clearly if we examine it from a macro historical perspective. So that's what I would like to do today. I would like to attempt to make visible and bring into focus the constructive processes of unification and integration that have been moving forward in the world, alongside the self-destruction that is going on in the realms of the old and the outward. I also would like to shed light on the new dialectic or historical dynamic within which the constructive ideals challenge the destructive process, while the horrors of the destructive plane energize and give new momentum to the constructive process. Now, let's take a moment before we go any further to define what I mean by constructive and destructive. In my book, Peace for a Planet, I have identified the 5 major root causes of war as racism, nationalism, religious strife, gender inequality, and extremes of wealth and poverty. And I have provided extensive evidence in my book on how each one of these elements has functioned as a source of destabilization, conflict, and war throughout history. But I will just take a few moments here to mention a few very, very brief examples. Let's take racial, nationalistic, and religious prejudice together, for example. There are numerous examples in the past history and in recent history that show us how prejudice against a particular race, nationality, or religion has not only caused extreme devastation for the minority groups being discriminated against, but it has also destabilized the entire world. The Holocaust in Hitler's Germany and the Second World War that followed it present only one historical instance of this kind of global destabilization. Extremes of wealth and poverty, for example, both within and among nations, where a few people have billions that can be spent in several lifetimes, and the majority live in poverty, is another very destabilizing factor in the world. And of course, this destabilization happens in many different ways. Just to cite one example, one of the most important root causes that radicalizes young people in various parts of the world and leads them to become easy targets for recruitment by terrorist masterminds is poverty. In other words, poverty is one of the root causes of both war and terrorism. Among these root causes, gender inequality is perhaps the most insidious of them all, though we don't often think of it that way. There are many different ways in which gender inequality prevents us from achieving a peaceful world, but one of the many ways in which it functions as a root cause of war is by creating and perpetuating a hyper-masculine leadership culture that devalues the traits we typically associate with the feminine aspects of humanity, such as emotional intelligence, and rejects peaceful orientation as, quote, weakness, while glorifying aggression as strength. In other words, the continued dominance of the hypermasculine leadership culture functions as a barrier to peace by glorifying what has been socially constructed to be masculine, namely aggressive progression of forceful domination and control, and devaluing what has been socially constructed to be feminine, namely empathy, compassion, emotional intelligence, open communication, and even moral courage. Now, please note that here I'm not speaking about male versus female leaders. This is very important, but rather about the masculine versus feminine aspects of humanity in leadership. I'll say more about this later. So based on these definitions of the primary root causes of war, going back to our first objective here, any progress in the collective global consciousness of humanity that can counteract division and prejudice and lead us toward unity in diversity in terms of race, nationality, religion, and gender would be defined as constructive, while racism, nationalism, religious strife, gender inequality, and extremes of wealth and poverty would be defined as destructive. In addition to providing historical evidence in my book of how these factors have functioned as the primary root causes of war, I have also traced the parallel constructive and destructive events and processes I mentioned in relation to each of these root causes. Because our time is limited, I will just give you an overview of some of the more important milestones in the constructive process. One of the things that we notice immediately when we look at historical trends during the last 200 years is that revolutionary changes began to take place in every aspect of human life in the early mid-19th century. The most obvious of these revolutionary changes was the exponential rise in the number of scientific discoveries and technological innovations, which started with the sending of the first telegraph on May 24, 1844. The invention of the telegraph broke the barriers of time and space that for millennia had stood in the way of people being able to communicate beyond, their small geographic location. So for the first time in human history, people could communicate instantly with distant lands. And shortly after that, the world saw an exponential rise in the number of scientific and technological innovations. This particular graph shows the number of innovations patented or inventions patented in the US in the 1800s, and you can see a very decisive exponential rise right around year 1850. Similarly, there were the data speed rose exponentially and mass use of inventions as well. But another, perhaps more important thing that happened in the mid-19th century was the fact that certain ethical truths, which of course existed in previous traditions and discussions and philosophical ideas, but these ethical truths emerged into the collective consciousness of humanity. And I love this idea of collective consciousness. So I use it quite a bit, and I believe that there is such a thing. And so these new collective consciousness made more visible three things in the areas of action. One, that all human beings are entitled to equal dignity and rights. Two, that women and men have been created equal. And three, that all human beings share a collective destiny. So this idea of interdependence. And this set into motion a process of positive social change, which, although very slow and gradual, has been moving steadily and decisively in the right direction during the last 2 centuries. And I will just share a few examples. Here's a graph of the laws enacted against slavery, which shows the emergence of the first principle of equality and dignity of human beings. And of course, it took many more decades and great sacrifice by many courageous human beings to finally abolish slavery, but it did finally happen during the 19th century. Slavery was abolished in the UK in 1834 and in the US in 1865. Then the first stirrings of concrete action that went beyond limited philosophical discussions about the concept of equality for women happened in the summer of 1848, when a decisive step was taken at the Seneca Falls Conference in New York, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her compatriots. And it was here that for the first time in human history, a public declaration was made about the need to advance the rights of women, or at least known history. It took nearly 70 years, but finally women in the United States were allowed to vote as of 1920. So progress is very slow, but it is happening. Another major step was taken during the first Parliament of World Religions held in Chicago in 1863, which represented 6 different religions and faith traditions. And this event was very interesting because it formally introduced the idea of, quote, the essential unity of all religions into the global discourse. Since then, the Parliament of World Religions has been held many more times at different locations across the planet, and the most recent one, which I attended and presented at, was held in 2023 and represented more than 95 countries and 210 faith traditions. So from 6 to 210. Another major milestone in the 19th century was the introduction of the idea of, not the introduction, but active discussion by the world's political leaders of the idea of peaceful resolution of international conflicts. This happened at the Hague Conference of 1899 when the Tsar Nicholas II of Russia convened the first international conference of the world's sovereigns at The Hague to discuss a means for peaceful settlement of international dispute. And the most tangible product of that conference was the fact that it planted an important seed into our collective consciousness in the realm of political discourse about the need to establish a world tribunal comprised of a panel of experts in international law that could offer help in resolving international disputes. And not long after that conference, actually, the destructive process in the world led to the outbreak of the First World War, and the horrific shock of that bloodshed pushed the world's leaders to take further steps to strengthen this idea of peaceful resolution of disputes that was discussed 2 decades earlier. And this time, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 had a provision for the establishment of a permanent court of international justice and the world's first formally organized intergovernmental body, the League of Nations, which was established in 1920. Although the League of Nations collapsed within 2 years, it provided an important precedent for the coming together of the world's nations within a collective system. Before that, we did not have any examples of such a thing. Once again, within a decade, the destructive processes in the world led to the Second World War, but this time, the horrific scale of the destruction and bloodshed stimulated the resolve of the international community to establish a far more comprehensive system of supranational cooperation, namely what we know today as the United Nations, based on the principles of collective security and respect for international law. So as you can see, in effect, the ideas that were first discussed at the Intergovernmental Gathering at The Hague in 1899 came to fruition and to concrete shape less than half a century later with the establishment of the World Court in 1945 as an integral part of the United Nations, and 50 years after that, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, was inaugurated. You know, both of them are established in a particular part of the world. Do you know where they are? At The Hague. You see? It was discussed in 1899. Now we have both of those courts well established at The Hague. Not that they have all the power yet, but the point is how this process moves forward. Interestingly, during the last several decades, many scholars have written about the slow but gradual declining violence around the world. You wouldn't know it, but that's actually what has happened. The most notable among the authors who have written about this historical trend is Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard University, who wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. Despite the fact that wars still continue to rage in some parts of the world, notably, of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the Hamas-Israel war, which has for now reached a state of ceasefire, during the last 40 years, many significant transformative events have happened in the direction of a more peaceful world. Pinker, for example, reminds us that just a few centuries ago, invading other countries and conquering them was a normal part of the job description of every national leader. In other words, Once someone became the king or ruler of a country, their next question was, where should I invade next? But during the last several decades, invasion for the purpose of extending territory has become illegal under international law, though obviously the invasion of Ukraine shows that it still can happen. And many other significant changes have happened as well. And here we see some of those changes. Just 5 decades ago, we lived in a world in which any of the following changes appeared to be impossible. Yet, all of them took place in succession and within a relatively short period of time. So the US and the former Soviet Union declared peace in the early 1990s. China of the Cultural Revolution transformed into a major global economic power and became a trading partner to a large number of countries around the world. Apartheid, one of the most blatant forms of institutionalized racism, was dismantled in South Africa. The world saw an end to the process of colonialization. By the 1970s, all such colonies had gained political independence. And most remarkably, perhaps, Europe, which had given the world 2 of its bloodiest wars as recently as the first half of the 20th century, found its way to peaceful cooperation and ultimately political unification under the European Union. So as a result, the borders between these countries, which had seen so much bloodshed for centuries, are now marked by nothing more than a welcome sign. So we also see a kind of a maturation of a process of international collaboration and collective consciousness through a number of summits and meetings that have been held in the 21st century by the United Nations. And I'm not going to go through them, you can see them, the list, but the idea is that, again, we are very slowly arriving at this idea of collective responsibility for the entire humanity. So even in this brief discussion, again to conclude this section of the talk, we can see clearly that in the last 2 centuries, every horrific event in the destructive plane has fueled the constructive process in a process of mutual interaction or dialectic. In this new dialectic, the processes of destruction and construction do not clash with one another, but rather they move forward simultaneously and side by side on separate planes. So here's a very, very important question now that we need to ask. Why is it that the destructive process in the world is so much more visible to the naked eye today? I would like to propose that the glaring visibility of the destructive process is the result of the fact that the destructive process and the old ways of thinking associated with it have been challenged under the spotlight that has been shown on them by the constructive process. Of course, I'm proposing this as one of the factors. In other words, the reason is that the constructive consciousness has shown a bright light on the destructive mindsets of the past, such as racism, nationalism, religious strife, and gender inequality and has delegitimized them. So in the process, those who benefited from and were privileged by these delegitimized ways of thinking have stood up to fight back in the most extremist form in what I call the last stand, or a last stand. So in the context of the new historical dialectic that I have been discussing, the current turmoil in the world may be considered to be in large part the result of the threat posed by the constructive process to the destructive, or the constructive consciousness, actually, constructive collective consciousness to the destructive and the old, not the other way around. From this perspective, contemporary racism, whether political or religious, contemporary extremism, whether political or religious, may be viewed mainly as a reaction to the threat presented by the constructive spirit of our age to the old and delegitimized and dying way of life that is reflected in the destructive process. So whether it be religious extremists seeking to reestablish caliphates and revive old laws in the Middle East, or white supremacist groups spreading hate against immigrants and identifying them as the root of all social ills in various countries, or politicians promising to return a country to its old days of glory, or old imperialist powers trying to reassert their domination, all of these entities share a striking similarity. They all look to the old days as their utopia and hold up the promise to their desperate listeners that they are the ones who will succeed in turning back the clock to the days when pride and privilege were showered upon them simply because they belonged to a specific group or nation. So, given this gradual but steady progress in the constructive global consciousness, my main point for today is that we must stay the course. We must have hope and stay the course. At the system level, we must continue to work to strengthen the existing international collaborative systems. But more importantly, at the individual level, we must deepen and strengthen the relationships among human beings of all backgrounds and facilitate new relationships rooted in a global sense of belonging. Because it is ultimately this sense of belonging, a critical choice between an exclusive or an inclusive identity, that holds the key to a lasting peace. And we are indeed very powerful as individuals. That's a discussion for another day. So fortunately, the science of the 21st century has emerged as a strong ally in breaking down the myths that have for a long time paralyzed humanity's will to take action toward peace. Today, growing research evidence in anthropology, psychology, and genetics has shown that A, our sense of identity is not static. B, human beings are actually not aggressive by nature. And C, unity in diversity is the primary pattern of the universe and the source of life for all living organisms. So although efforts to divide and conquer societies based on tribal identities and creating us versus them narratives based on disinformation are still able to wreak havoc and cause horrific, destructive events in our world, the history of civilization is filled with evidence that human beings are capable of expanding their sense of identity and becoming more and more inclusive. Any examples? How about the successive expansion of the primary unit of identity throughout human civilization, from the family to the village, to the tribe, to the city-state, and to the nation? Of course, today we speak about global citizenship, don't we? It is in our consciousness. And this means that every human being is also fully capable of becoming a world citizen and identifying with all of humanity. I have this picture of fractal patterns here because science is increasingly showing us, and these days I'm very much into quantum physics, which is fascinating. I'm learning so much about it. But science, the cutting-edge science of the 21st century, has shown us that already that despite the amazing variety in the shapes and colors of minerals, plants, and animals on the planet, and the vastness and diversity reflected in the billions of galaxies in the cosmos, an inherent unity is visible at all levels of the universe, from our own DNA, which has fractal patterns, to galaxies millions of light years away, from the subatomic to the macrocosmic, and in between, both. So as such, unity in diversity is the primary law of the universe, both physical and spiritual. So I hope I have, at least in this short discussion, presented a little bit of evidence of how there are many evidence-based and scientific reasons to have hope for the future of humanity. Now, going to the next point in my presentation regarding leadership for peace. One question, of course, is that hopefully we can ask is, what can we do as individuals, whether we are students, professors, supervisors, business leaders, or whatever other position, because we are all leaders. All of us are leaders. What can we do? But beyond that, in the larger sense of what we identify as, people who are in leadership positions in different contexts, what changes do we need to make in the culture of leadership at the national and international levels to move the peace process forward? Let's take a look at what research has been telling us about effective leadership. Since the 1990s, leadership research has consistently reached the same conclusions about the most effective leadership traits. In a meta-analysis of hundreds of leadership research studies conducted since the early 1990s, Smith and Smiths, the researchers stated the following, that the archetype of self-absorbed, competitive, aggressive, and even ruthless leader was reborn for the selfless steward, who leads by helping subordinates, cooperating with peers, nurturing a sense of family, and these are behaviors that obviously we tend to associate with the early socialization of females in most cultures. And this basically reflects these emerging models have shown a shift from influence to exercise of power or position to influence through persuasion or interpersonal networking, from competition, playing hard, to cooperation, playing fair, from individualism, by me, for me, to collectivism, team first, and from exclusionary, divide and conquer, to inclusionary, power sharing, and sense of family. So these are the qualities that have been shown scientifically to be the most effective in any leadership position, whether business, organizational, or in any other context. And of course, we can easily extrapolate that these are also the qualities that are most conducive to effective leadership for peace. In fact, they're precisely the qualities that we need to be able to move forward toward a more prosperous and peaceful world. But as you can see, I'm always emphasizing in my approach to this issue that even though we associate these qualities with the feminine aspects of humanity, embracing them is not the domain of any one gender. People of all genders are equally capable of them because these are human qualities that all of us possess. But one of the things that we must reckon with is the psychologically internalized values that have glorified power over service and control over empathy for centuries. And this continues to remain an ongoing challenge in leadership. Of course, one of the most important barriers to progress in this area is the traditional gender role socialization that we continue to give to our children, particularly to our boys. We still, I think, bring them up to see aggressiveness as strength and peaceful orientation as feminine and therefore weakness. And really importantly, in the context of the current hyper-masculine leadership culture, even when women do enter the leadership arena, they are pressured to give up their potentially feminine strengths of empathy, compassion, care, and so on, and instead imitate a power and domination-obsessed approach to leadership. And I say potentially because, as I said, it's not that women necessarily have a certain set of traits and men have another set. It's the way that we have shaped our culture and what emphasis we place in bringing up people of different genders. And what I would like to do is to frame the entire discourse on gender inequality, which of course has many different aspects. But one of the things that is really important is to understand and acknowledge that gender inequality harms all of humanity, boys and men, as well as women and girls. And there is so much research on this, which is not talked about often. So gender inequality, therefore, is a men's issue as much as it is a women's issue. It is a human issue. So, and this is, a huge topic, that's one of the areas that I am focusing my research on here on campus, is the socialization, gender role socialization of young people, and trying to see if we can take an approach where we can bring people of all genders together to collaborate in promoting gender equality as co-beneficiaries. And of course, in terms of a leadership culture, we definitely need one for peace that balances feminine and masculine qualities and applies them wisely and appropriately to address global challenges. So here, I made sure that I leave enough time for us to have some question and answer period today, but also I would like to tell you that if you want to, meet with me or at some point, I'm reserving Mondays, exact time as today, Deacon Building, 4th floor, at the Research Institute offices or by appointment, and that's my email address. So thank you so much for being here. And I'll take your questions. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, please go ahead. Yes, thank you.
My name's Ilan. I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow at ICU.
Lan?
Ilan.
Ilan.
Yeah. Studying public policy and studies. Just one clarification question, and then maybe a follow-up. More the start of the presentation, the root cause of in your start of the presentation, the root causes of conflict, you had the last point was extreme wealth and poverty.
Extremes of wealth and poverty, yes.
Yes. Is sort of resource conflict connected with that? Because I think a lot of conflicts around the world are about land or oil or those kinds of resources. Does that point cover that reason of conflict?
I think that tradition, thank you so much for that's a really good question. Conflicts in terms of resources is something that has been looked at quite a lot in the literature as, what has started wars. But in my thinking, unless there is a situation of great deprivation on one side and, great wealth on the other side, that is a separate thing. And I personally think that falls under some of the nationalistic greed, individualism, wanting more and more and more kind of tendencies of people. So they want, like I mentioned briefly, I remember when I was much younger, our history books were just like, okay, so-and-so became a leader and he decided to invade such and such country and become so-and-so the great, burned down everything, took over everything, took all the resources. I think that is a separate concept, but I think the extremes of wealth and poverty that I talk about is basically how, just the inequalities. We have billionaires who honestly cannot in any way spend a fraction of their money in 10 lifetimes, even if they try. And then you have people who don't have food to eat, who are starving. And I have a chapter on terrorism also. I just mentioned that briefly in my book, and I show actually how all five of these root causes go into the creation of terrorism. Poverty is just one of them. So yeah, I'm just focusing on these. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And sorry, if I could just have one more
Yes,
follow-up.
please go ahead.
So just quite selfishly, I'm doing my research on the sort of distribution of resources between traditional security, so military and that kind of thing, and then the comparison with what kinds of resources go into diplomacy and conflict prevention and peace building. And I'm interested to know your view, because, you know, based on what you're saying about, you know, how do we tackle it, you know, what can we do ourselves, you know, looking at new leadership sort of traits and things like that. What do you think is a way that we might be able to rebalance, you know, some of these enormous sums of money that are going towards military expenditure to conflict prevention and resolution and peace building initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And again, I think that's, of course, there are so many different answers to that. One starts with education. I think that, you know, at the level that we see what's going on and you're studying around the world, tackling that directly, it may not be so effective or immediate. But I think that we need to think about these things in terms of, again, roots and root causes. That's why I'm really interested in, for example, I taught this Peace for Our Planet course, and young people, I found how effective it was, how transformative it could be when people are younger. So I think we need to put a lot more emphasis on how we bring up children, how we teach our youth, as we continue to also, you know, engage in these the discourses regarding, you know, the fact that, you know, you spend, like, what is it, 2 billion on an F2? I don't even know the names of these. And you can eliminate poverty in a whole nation with just one of those. How crazy is that, right? So we really need to keep on that discourse, but I think the change has to be fundamental from the roots, from, you know, in the new generation. And by the way, I'm interviewing Gen Z, young people, on the issue of gender role socialization and collaborative approaches to gender equality. And I'm so encouraged to see we are really, like, our young people are moving forward. So that's wonderful. So I don't have like a specific answer for that question, but I think how we bring up especially our boys and girls in terms of, you know, what traits they should have as leaders, I think that's really an important area. Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and then behind you, there was also.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loya, for the presentation. Maybe just to add a bit to what Ilan has said, I think as far as nation states still actually place, should I say, precedent on national security as against human security, we always have the budget tilting more towards funding, wars and everything. I'm sorry to say that. There's also the economics of war. Who produces the weapons? Who benefits when we buy these things? Yeah. So as far as some people are making money to continue, rather than invest in peace education, tackling it from the root causes, focusing on human security, it will take them, but will yield results, just like Dr. Ryan said, going to the root causes. They don't want to do that investment because it doesn't make sense to them in terms of financial benefits. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. So maybe my own question, just wanted to comment, I wanted to question. I'm sorry I came a bit late.
That's okay, don't worry about it.
I really look forward to this, Dr. Ryan. and I've actually really enjoyed it. I would like us, I want to ask, can we create a space where we continue to have this kind of discussion? Because
Absolutely.
we should be co-beneficiaries and co-creators of peace. You understand? So if we can actually create a space, maybe it's once a month, twice a month.
I would love to.
Okay,
I'm all for it. Yes.
okay. I think another thing, talking about the Hague, City of Peace, because that's what we call it in the peace building space. I also think it's a little bit funny because they're also like in a tight position. When having a discussion some time back, they cannot really take a position on issues as far as it has to do with security because they house the ICJ, the ICC, that's International Court of Justice, and all of that. So when we go, they were like, we used to actually, this was one of the questions I asked at the head during summer. I was there for a refresher. I was like, Netherlands, why don't you take a position on the situation in Gaza? And I'm like, oh, you know, we are supposed to be neutral. We host all these international institutions. We cannot be seen as, I said, no, you know what is right. Why don't you just say what is right and what is wrong is wrong? So at times it can be a very tight, wonderful dynamics playing out there in terms of international politics.
You're absolutely right. I mean, even the UN is really not fulfilling its, none of these entities are fulfilling their charter yet. For example, the UN formally has the Security Council and the veto power. So that really is negating the charter of the UN for collective security. So the existence of the ICC and the World Court is wonderful, but we're still not there, like you said. And many countries, some powerful countries are not even supporting it or are signatories to it. So that's a problem. But again, it's a gradual process. That's really my point, is that we have to see the gradualness of it and that it takes work, but that we have been able to move forward and we will be able to move forward. We cannot give up and say, okay, there's so much awful stuff going on, right? Thank you so much for your questions. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
You could please say your name. You could say your name.
I'm Ayumi. Well, thank you for your conference. I don't really have much knowledge because I'm a first-year student, but the earlier talk about education, I was thinking, how can we educate younger people without it turning into propaganda? Because technically, even if it is oriented towards peace and it is beneficial for everyone, it still says an ideology that's not necessarily shared by everyone. And also, these international laws are often based on law, and it's often the same city, like The Hague, and there's always the fact that the leading nations stay in the Western countries. And how can we keep, because they don't have bad values, but they're not necessarily values that come from everywhere, and other nations might have other point of views that align with their own cultures that can still be applied to other people. And so how could we keep the sovereignty of each nation and their cultures and still create this global, internationally acceptable law and mindset for everyone?
Wonderful. Those are such wonderful questions. And so, tell me your name again. Ayumi. Thank you, Ayumi. So taking your first question, absolutely. education and indoctrination are two very different things. True education suggests things and then asks people to reflect on it and do their own research and think about things and come up with their own ideas. What I can tell you is that I have been a peace educator, so I've taught like a course called Peace for Our Planet for several years. And I had students from every background you can think of in terms of like, it was in the US, but they were, some of them from very so-called progressive, some were very conservative, small town. They had maybe just small town in Minnesota, and girls and boys and everyone, and just all backgrounds, even religious or some racial diversity as well. And what I found was that if we focus not on politics, but on principles. What are the principles, universal principles that we can agree on? What are the things that we want to do as human beings? And we discuss things that way and approach the discussion that way. I found that there was no problem. It didn't matter because, and also we don't mention the names of politicians, right? If we stay away from politics, which immediately divides people, if we discuss things as at the level of principle and what we all aspire to, just as human beings, and we are all created noble, I believe. So once we focus on our own nobility, I tell you, my last, the thing that I asked my questions to do in addition to a final paper and everything that they had was to give a 2 to 3 minute statement at the end of the course, responding to this question. What was the most important insight you gained as a result of this course, and how are you going to use it to make the world a better place? I'm telling you, I usually had 16, 17, 18 students. By the time the 4th or 5th student had presented, I was already in tears. I mean, they had to give me like Kleenex because I was so touched. How can just one course create such tangible transformation? I'm not saying that it was me. I think it was our collective engagement in heart-to-heart exchanges that were based on principle and our innermost desires as noble human beings. So it can work, and that it can be education without indoctrination. And there may be disagreement on certain points or principles, and we can talk about those things. In regards to your second question, I think that's one of the issues that we have in the world. For many years, I taught international communication, and one of the major issues in that was the imbalance between the Western nations, domination of the discourses at the global level, versus some of the other, countries in the world. And that is an issue, but that we do need to address. We need to become much more inclusive. So I don't know, like an immediate answer to your question, but I think that one of the things that I actually mentioned in my book is that cultures tend to, if they stay in isolation or if they just focus on themselves, they can become very narrow and destructive. Whereas when cultures come together, they balance each other, and we can create a wonderful global culture that represents all the varieties. And one example that I give, for example, is living in Japan. For many years, I knew that it was so hard for people to, not be able to express themselves. So they, that created a lot of issues. And on the other hand, the individualism of the US, for example, is also can become so destructive when it is taken to an extreme. So if people can become familiar with each other's cultures and have more of a melding, I think we will get a much better global culture. But I hope this answers your question. Yes.
Yes,
Stefan?
second question. There is nothing that is written. Yes, about the second question about the international law being imposed in countries. There is nothing that is written somewhere in Western countries like The Hague or New York that is written, and then all the people of the world that follow all the countries of the world. It doesn't exist. What we call international law is a corpus of treaties and pacts like the United Nations Chart, which has been agreed by all the nation states who signed their agreement to respect those principles, like, for example, the peaceful resolution of disputes. That's what we call international law. International law is the law that is agreed upon by all 99% of the countries of the world. Nothing is imposed. All the countries of the world that are part of the international community, which is humanity, the countries of the world who are part of the United Nations, agree to these principles themselves. They signed the official governments of all the countries of the world agree to these principles. There is nothing which is written by a Western guy or in New York. It's all the countries of the world who agree to these principles.
Yeah, it's often these treaties, the people who are signatories, not the people, but the countries who are signatories sometimes don't uphold them, which is a problem, including the human rights. Yeah. Does that? Do you have any other?
Just wanted to give a definition of.
Yeah, definition of international law, right, that's right. If it's international law, it has been agreed upon, but then I think the point is also well taken that different countries deal with these things differently. They either don't follow them or try to impose them, or, those are the dynamics that create difficulties. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was curious, when we're talking about constructive and destructive forces in the world, I feel I've been having a lot of conversations lately on the topic of competition. And a lot of people say, well, competition is good, and people view it sometimes as like a primary motivator for like scientific progress, or like technological progress, even going back to like, the moon landing and like the US viewing it as like, well, we have to beat Russia. So like in the race for technological advancement, competition is often viewed as like a primary motivator. And I'm curious as to whether you feel like, does that fall under constructive forces or destructive forces? And is it possible to have like healthy competition, or like sort of how do you view that maybe in opposition to like collaboration as a primary motivator for change? But yeah, just curious, like, is competition good or bad?
That's a really, really good question. I think competition, there are different kinds of competition. I guess that would be my answer. For example, we can all start competing in how kind we are to other people, right? Or, how generous we are, or, it's a possibility, it's a kind of competition, right? So it depends on what you are competing for. But And so what it is motivated by and what you're competing for. So if competition means that it's just another way of advancing self-interest and ego, then I think it's destructive, because that is really the seed, the selfishness of our lower nature is destructive, basically, to us, first of all, as well as to other people. So I think that depending on the motivation and what we are doing it for, it may vary, but fundamentally, I think that in the abstract, I would put sort of ruthless competition in the category of destructive, and certain kinds of competition, are fine, but collaboration, I think, is definitely constructive. Again, collaboration to do something good, obviously, right? That same thing applies. Collaborating to, I don't know, stab someone in the back really well, it doesn't, it's not great, but does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it does. That's kind of what I was thinking, like how the two can go hand in hand. But even in the abstract, like if you're competing to be kind, like are you actually being kind? Or like if the goal is to be the most or the best of anything, it inherently is viewing like your relationship to other people as
that's why I was saying that it depends on your motivation. So if we decide that that's how we are motivated by creating a better world. And so let's see how well we can let our heart burn with loving kindness for all who cross our paths. Then that's okay. But if it's motivated to say, oh no, I'm the one, again, selfishness. So yeah. Okay. Oh, we have so many questions. Wonderful. Then you go ahead and then
You could say your name. I'm Jan.
yes.
So my question is specifically on collective unconscious.
Collective consciousness.
Unconscious. Collective consciousness.
Yes.
So maybe I would like to ask if there is like a verified scientific research on that, because like I'm coming from like colonial perspective, colonial theory perspective, because like whose collective consciousness are you referring to that we are moving forward in that direction? Because like from maybe a post-colonial theory, I would kind of think that, globalization, maybe a new neo-colonialization, because why do we need to globalize? Like, because like in my research and like, and my own research about like what happened post-colonialism, like these deep-rooted post-colonial effect has done more harm than good to the colonies. And like, sometimes I think like, why do we need to globalize if we have just allowed a different culture to exist without having to like globalize? Because like this collective consciousness maybe just be a representation of those in power, and research like mostly from Western ideas or Western. So like maybe related to what Ayumi said, like how true is this for all culture or for all people? I'm not saying that I'm against it, but like how is this really representing all walks of life? Because like I understand how good it could be, but potentially in practice it may not really be good, because like there's like a cultural capital involved here. Like I would say that there's this general principle for everyone to adhere to. And, yeah.
Thank you. This is a very good question. And so I would say that my definition, so this question was something we would talk about. Globalization is a totally different thing. It has different definitions, and what is the actual definition, and You know, so that's a very complex thing. So I would start by saying that by collective consciousness, I don't mean any kind of ideology of anyone, but we do as human beings, you know, again, the science of today is showing that, of course, it's at the quantum level, so it's just my sort of what I'm really interested in is that we do put out our thoughts have energy. So, you know, these energies actually do amplify each other. And so that's really the level I'm talking about. You know, as ideas arise and people's ideas and energies influence each other through their conversations and exchanges, that's what I'm talking about. It's a much more abstract thing than globalization. But that's a discussion we could have maybe more of here. And peace talks. Yes, peace talks next. And I know we have gone past time. We have 2 more questions quickly. Mireille, and then your name?
Brianne.
Brianne.
Hi, Professor. My name is Mirai. While listening to your talk, I felt that expanding the sense of identity is one way kind of compromising community activity. And however, specifically from the religious aspects, compromising can be viewed as undevoted behaviors or sometimes seen as a faith evil or yes. So
can you say that again? I wasn't sure. Compromising?
Yeah. So you talked about expanding the sense of identity is important for happiness, but in particularly religious aspects, those activities kind of seen as undevoted behavior.
Oh, yeah, you're betraying like your tradition. So, did you lose the sound?
Yeah, sorry.
I think she lost the sound.
So in a such case, do you think to what extent humans can be still available to expand the sense of identity in specifically religious space?
You know, that's a really good question. And I'm not saying that it's always easy, right? There are always those problems and barriers. But what I was referring to was that it is possible, right? Because sometimes the myth is that we are not able to, right? That we have like this, we always have to cling to this very tight, very limited identity, but that's not by nature necessarily who we are. That's not written in stone. But it's what you're saying are some of the things that prevent people from being able to do that. And those are very real. That's my short answer. Yeah, good question. Please go ahead. Last.
So my name's Brianne again. I'm just kind of curious generally. I guess a lot of what you were speaking about really kind of talks about values related to like kindness and empathy, and you mentioned love and stuff in what you were saying. And I don't necessarily, from my experience, feel like conversations around peace and conversations in this space really allow for such, I guess, emotions and elements of care to exist. So I guess firstly, I really appreciate that, because I think, especially in academia, it's so disconnected. So it's more of a broad question, but how are you navigating that? Because I've had conversations where I've spoken about certain concepts and they're like, there's no room for that in international relations, in peace discussion. They're looking at the very pragmatic, logical perspectives of things. And I think what's missing is elements of kindness and care and love and those values that allow us to do what we need to do to promote that. So I was just wondering, how have you kind of experienced and navigated that in your work?
I think I'm just unabashed about it. I think that moral imagination, moral courage, these are things that are that are essential to anything we do as human beings. All of the things that may be happening, you know, in the areas of the people you were talking to, they're really very mechanistically approaching things, you know, A leads to B and so on. But that denies the reality of our humanity and how actually things get done. So I think that if they tell you it's irrelevant, you can say, no, it's actually the most fundamental. Well, you know, it's just that, yeah, I see it in my, you know, how can I say, in my mind, in my heart. And so it's part of my reality. So I just, you know, share that and incorporate it in my work. And I don't think anyone can tell you that what you think is not relevant. I think that you can develop a language as you study this too.
Would be really great to, I guess, get some guidance on that, because I think especially this term they've been.
Please come to Monday discussions. All of you are here. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, then she will be sending you an email with the information, so you can, because she's still doing some research with Gen Z. So if you are within that age group, she will be very pleased to interview you about your views about the gender equality. So you, I already have.
But I love with this you know, suggestion that we have a space for even like group discussions. And I'm available so we can generate that for sure. Thanks again for being here, everyone. Thank you so much. It was lovely to meet all of you.
Hi. She has sent the slides.